12 o'clock, so we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you all for coming. I'm Holly Marquess from the History Department.
I'm Sharon Wilson from the English Department.
So we're here to talk to you today about young adult literature and the Holocaust. We had come across this article in the New York Times referencing a survey that was done by the Conference on Jewish Material Claims Against Germany. They surveyed people and broke it out by age, and they found that 31% of Americans and 41% of millennials thought fewer than 2 million Jews died in the Holocaust. 41% of Americans and 66% of millennials surveyed said that they couldn't say what Auschwitz was. So they're finding significant gaps in knowledge about the Holocaust, particularly from millennials. So the VP of this Jewish Material Claims Against Germany said there remain troubling gaps in Holocaust awareness while survivors are still with us. Imagine when there are no longer survivors here to tell their stories. So we thought we had to do a time talk on this. Start with this.
Actually, I found something as I was doing, so here I am again. I was teaching techniques of teaching English this morning, and we were talking in our text, and one of the quotes that kind of jumped out to me was that only 43% of American high school students pass the SAT test. And what I thought was interesting about that is that the authors of this book and other scholars have said that one of the reasons they think that the scores are so low is because there's been a slow erosion of our humanness and our humanity, the loss of narrative imagination, empathy that come from reading and discussing the lives, ideas, and experiences of others who are different from or similar to ourselves, that reading gets to our deeper self, and that young adult literature is one source that we can use whether you are a young adult or you're old like me. The readership of young adult literature has increased. Most of the books that are sold, I know you have your sources of getting ebooks and things, but most of the books that are sold to people between the ages of 40 and 65. So you have, young adult literature has a wide audience, which is why we decided to focus our discussion today on young adult literature and the plethora of new books that have come out in regards to young adult literature. One of our favorite books, and I taught this last fall, is Between Shades of Gray. And this book by Ruta Sepetys, right? Sepetys, okay. History writes my stories, and so I do feel a tremendous responsibility, but I also know that young adult readers are deep thinkers. They are deep feelers, and I think that books we read when we're 13 or 14 have an ability to make a profound, lasting impression on us. And when I read that quote when I taught this book and the next book, Salt to the Sea, I said that history and its impact can really change the way we perceive so many things. And to be honest, humanness has gone out of our society. I mean, I think it's slowly eroding. I don't care where you look. Humanity is at a crucial point, I think, in our lives. So young adult literature provides us with the venue, I think, to explore those human values, those empathy values that we have. And I think historical novels have a way of reaching individuals that say, I know you've all taken history classes. My husband was a history teacher. I think she is too. I've heard rumors that she teaches history. Does she teach history? Any of you have her? You don't have her? You do. Okay, so she's saying yes. Okay, she's admitting it. Okay, she's admitting it. It can be dry and factual based. It has to be factually based. But when you take that history and you make it into fiction, then you've got something that you can understand. You've got something you can empathize with. And most of these authors, am I going beyond my time?
No.
Okay. Most of these authors that write historical novels supplement or tell us how they arrived at the content that they did. This latest book that just came out, The Tattooist of Auschwitz, it's a book geared for adults, but young adults have responded so overwhelmingly to it. She took 3 years out of her life to talk to the individual on which this piece of fiction was based. Ruta Sepetys took years to examine the Holocaust in Between Shades of Gray, and then in Salt to Sea, she examined Lithuanian, she examined Poland, she examined a lot of different, I think that's right. Yeah, okay. I've read so many books lately, sometimes I can't keep them straight. But examined 4 different countries who were affected by the Holocaust. And her research, she did a plethora of research. So it's historically sound, historically based. And did you want to talk about the numbers?
So, Ruta Sepetys, in an article she writes about using historical fiction, says historical novels provide a compelling introduction to underrepresented time periods and events. Through characters and story, historical statistics become human, and we know that stories of human experience resonate deeper than statistics. Now, there's a quote that a number of variations of this quote are attributed to Stalin, where he says, "A single death is a tragedy, a million deaths is a statistic." And so kids in school learn that 6 million Jews died in the Holocaust, but that seems like a statistic to them. So when they read a story that they can connect with, that's really compel them, can pull them in, get them thinking, and then go out and do some research and think, if this one family goes through this, then what about those other 6 million families? So when it becomes real to themselves and they can start to put themselves into the shoes of their characters, these statistics seem more like tragedies to them. I teach a NonFiction book on the Holocaust in my relative class. We got the water. And students, when they write their papers, will tell me, well, we learned about the Holocaust in school, but the teacher just said 6 million Jews died and then moved on. Or I didn't really understand, or I didn't know what it was like in the everyday workings of the camp. But when they read these stories and it pulls them in, they're able to then go out and do research. And this YA historical fiction is very compelling. I'm going to read just a page, the first page of the Ruta Sepetys Between Shades of Gray here. They were taking Jonas, my beautiful, sweet brother who shooed bugs out of the house instead of stepping on them, who gave his little ruler to splint a crotchety old man's leg. "Mama, Lena," he cried, flailing his arms. "Stop," I screamed, tearing after them. Mother grabbed the officer and began speaking in Russian, pure, fluent Russian. He stopped and listened. She lowered her voice and spoke calmly. I couldn't understand a word. The officer jerked Jonas toward him. I grabbed onto his other arm. His body began to vibrate as sobs racked his shoulders. A big wet spot appeared on the front of his trousers. He hung his head and cried. Mother pulled a bundle of rubles from her pocket and exposed it slightly to the officer. He reached for it and then said something to Mother, motioning with his head. Her hand flew up and ripped the amber pendant right from her neck and pressed it into the NKVD's hand. He didn't seem to be satisfied. Mother continued to speak in Russian and pulled a pocket watch from her coat. I knew that watch. It was her father's and had his name engraved in the soft gold on the back. The officer snatched the watch, let go of Jonas, and started yelling at the people next to us. Have you ever wondered what a human life is worth? That morning, my brother's was worth a pocket watch.
Another book we're going to discuss, this is a recent book, Monica Hess, Girl in the Blue Coat. It centers around young girls. The first page centers around the young girl's decision not to get involved in what was going on in Amsterdam. She was a member of the black market, but she was a member of the black market so that she could survive. Survival was her key, was her mantra. She said she didn't have a choice in what she was going to do. But the process of interacting with and seeing what was happening to the Jews in Amsterdam, with everybody kind of standing back and not doing anything, she realized that after all, a real person, nor were Boss and Ollie, Mirjam, Roosevelt, and other characters mentioned by name. But as people continued to ask how an event could happen, how atrocious the Holocaust ever could have happened, I wanted to tell a story of a small betrayal in the middle of a big war, and that's Hanukkah. I wanted to illustrate the split-second decision we make of moral courage and cowardice, and how we are all villains. And one of the quotes that she talks about in the novel, and I'm not going to read it, I'm going to try to remember it from memory, is she's trying to save this young girl from being taken to the concentration camp. And so she stands outside of her apartment and sees hundreds of Jews being marched to the railroad station to be put in cattle cars to take to concentration camps. And as they're marching through town to be sent to their deaths, people are riding bikes, people are talking to each other, people are buying donuts. I don't think they had donuts then, but they're buying sweets and eating, completely oblivious to what's going on or not caring. And what she says is, I am appalled by how ordinary we have become and what we accept as ordinary. So you can see people dying in front of you, being marched to their death and not do anything, be non-committal. It reminds me of a newspaper, a news report last night in Wichita. The 33rd road rage incident happened in Wichita last night with a gun. A father and his child were cut off by someone who thought that he was going too slow. So he pulled out a gun and shot the father. The father got out of the car, went to the back seat where his baby was, grabbed the baby, and the car seat fell out, and the news reporter focused on that car seat. Now, I will remember that incident. 33 people being shot at with guns, but seeing that humanization, that car seat, that's something that I'll remember. And when she saw the blue coat walking past her, that was the girl that she wanted to save. So there was some kind of symbol that distinguished this young woman from all of the other people. And she said, I have to act. I have to do something, no matter the cost. And each one of the characters that we're talking about has to decide between being invisible and being visible. If you're invisible, you stay safe. You kind of hide in the corner. Joseph, who is a Jewish man Jewish young boy who has to flee, said being invisible is really the best way to approach life. Mohammed from Syria says the same thing. If you're invisible, you don't get beat up. But if you stand up for yourself, you're going to get beaten up, excuse me, I teach English, yes. You're going to get beaten up, okay? And there comes a point in the book when Mohammed says, wait a second. He's in Holland, and they're hungry, and they're trying to keep him from crossing over to Austria. And he said, no, I know I am broken, but I have to become visible. If I become visible, it's going to cost me potentially my life and my brother's life. But I have to become visible and assert myself. So as the UN observers are there in Hungary the Hungarians are trying to prevent their escape into Austria, he opens the door and he walks out. Walks in front of a lady who's holding a gun, and his little brother says, you're going to get shot. And he said, I'm walking to Austria. 12-hour walk after everything that they've been through. And so his brother, who hasn't talked throughout the entire book, follows him out. The kids follow him out, then the adults. The adults are the last to leave. But becoming visible has its cost. It has a cost for him. It has a cost for the other two characters in the book. It has a cost for her. By becoming visible, she loses her relationship with her parents. But saving a human life, just one person, gives her the impetus to become more vocal, be part of the Amsterdam resistance movement to save. And it started at college. The movement started in college, people. Okay? The change is up to you guys. is up to you and what you can do to reach out to people who are different, people who you don't know. In this book, he's talking to, the central character is talking to a group of gypsies, the last group to come in. They were considered the lowest of the low because of their nomadic, one reason because of their nomadic existence. But the main character, Laz, has the opportunity to have more freedom because he's the tattooist, the one who tattoos numbers on the arms of the people coming in. He has a little more mobility, so he goes to talk to the gypsies who have come in, and they converse, and he says, you know, if I'd seen you on the street, I would have gone to the other side of the street. I would have ignored you. And one of the gypsy characters, a male, the oldest male, said, I would have done the same thing if I had seen you on the street. I would have ignored you and gone across, or would have been fearful of you and crossed the street. So we fear what we don't know, so we don't change. And so that's what these books are about.
And many of them are about courage too, speaking out against injustice. Girl in the blue coat, she's, as Sharon mentioned, getting involved in resistance. She grapples with that. She knows it's going to put her and her family at risk, but she ultimately decides to speak out. In preparing for this Times talk, I read an article by Keith Stewart, who's a journalist. He's also written some YA novels as well. And he's writing this article called What YA Fiction Taught Me. And he said what he learned is that YA literature is indivisible from activism. He said everywhere he goes to speak to students all over the world, they share a feeling of powerlessness or fear for their future. They want to be seen and heard and empowered, and he feels like young adult literature gives them that power. And he says, as many times as you hear people grumble about, oh, those kids these days, that in many ways young people are much more equipped for activism than we were. He also says, the same author says, I've learned that if you're silent, you're part of the problem, and I think many of these books speak to that as well, that it's not enough just to not be a part of the persecution, but being silent is part of the problem as well. So giving young people, putting these really compelling books into the hands of young people helps them develop their moral sensibilities, helps them work on that sense of empathy. I think young people are very empathetic by nature. So not only giving a voice to historical information, but being able to apply that to current events or even interpersonal relationships as well. So Sharon talked a little bit about this book, Refugee, written by Alan Gratz. My son read this pretty recently, so when he saw that yesterday I was reading it too, he said, good choice, Mom. He loved it. He's just about to be 12, and so all of the characters in this book are about his age. And he finished it, and he comes out and he said, Mom, did you know there was this boat called the St. Louis, and they took all of these Jews, but nobody would take them? And I said, yeah, I did know it. And he, of course, couldn't help, even though I kept telling him, well, I haven't read the book yet. But he just couldn't help but let me know. And it really informed him about not only the ship, the St. Louis, but there is a Cuban refugee, young girl from Cuba in the late 90s, and a Syrian boy from 2015. So the author, as this quote says, that it's the job of all of us to look out for other people.
One of the things that I also liked about The Refugee is that the author talks a lot about Syria and how we've ignored Syria and the brutalities that continue to occur in Syria. And as a result of his research, he's donating a portion of the sales of this book to UNICEF to help take care of children. So each one of these authors, once they start exploring topics, they feel an ethical obligation to do something more than just write about it and talk about it. They feel an obligation to help those who aren't getting out, who are undernourished, who are, as that quote says, we need to see these people. So whether they're wearing a blue coat or whether they're wearing a cross or whatever, to see them and to help them. So I think historical fiction gives students, people, the ability to discern truth from falsehood and propaganda from fact. And if we didn't need it more now than we've ever needed it before, I don't know when we did. But to discern truth from falsehood. And I forgot my book, so I'm going to steal yours. I had it marked in my book, and I'm not going to be able to find it. But one of the reasons that she wrote this book, after she did all of these research, she didn't want to emphasize the gruesomeness of the 10,000 people that were killed on this boat, the William Gustav. These characters got on a boat with 12 lifeboats, 12. And there were thousands of people on this ship. It was all of the furniture was taken out because they were trying to get these refugees here in this boat to leave Germany because Russia was coming in. And the horrific events that the characters were exposed to, caught between the Nazis and caught between Stalin's men, where they heard that stories of women being nailed to a barn before they were killed, being nailed to a barn. The characters were terrified of what would happen, but they had no power. They were impotent. So they go to this city hoping that they can get on a boat and get out of there and go to Europe where they would be safe. And the Russians bombed the ship with torpedoes. So the Russians had more military might on their side than the Germans did. So more people were killed on this boat and nobody knew about it. Not nobody. Very few people knew about it. More people were killed here than on the Titanic and the Lusitania. And yet, she said, I wrote this book not because of the people who died. And I still remember this mother on the deck, one of the decks of the ship, knowing that she couldn't survive. So she threw her baby at somebody, hoping that somebody who made it to the lifeboat would save the baby. And she didn't throw it far enough. So some of the scenes that you see are kids in life jackets that were flipped over. So they drowned at sea. And she said, I have to write and give those people a voice. So that's why she wrote the book, was not because of the gruesome details, but I couldn't put this book down when I picked it up. I couldn't put any of these down.
And with this one, speaking of voice, there's 4 different perspectives. So you've got a Lithuanian girl, a Prussian boy, a Polish girl, and a young German Nazi who is just a loathsome toad through the whole thing. But you're getting that perspective too. He's feeling so proud of his Nazi uniform, and he sings this awful song to himself that degenerates people from other cultures. And so it goes back and forth, but it's in really palatable, just a page or 2 for each one, in putting it in a way that with these literary devices that students find easy to take in. So they're page turners, all of them.
One of the reasons some people look at young adult literature as not complex enough. The stories aren't complex enough to deal with in high school. In fact, we now, as a techniques teacher, I have to teach the future English teachers Common Core standards. And one of the Common Core standards is based on the complexity that students aren't reading intensely enough with complex literature. So they've only included 2 books in the Common Core standards that are quote unquote acceptable to read in high school. And The Book Thief is one of those books. It's a beautiful book. It's been bestseller since it was written, and it's still on the top 10 books that deal with the Holocaust, because the author, Zuzak, has taken people and fictionalized them, but they're living, breathing, visible people. And my argument is that young adult literature has come into its own. I read an article last year on we need to be critical of young adult literature, and we do. I think you need to be critical of anything that you read. I get excited about this. You need to be critical. You need to stand back and say, what are the benefits of this? And you know, if you read for pleasure, that some of the books about young adult lit are kind of like, oh, Bobby loves Susie and Susie loves Teddy and that kind of stuff. Many authors now are writing books because there's such a market, and so they'll write a book quickly and sell it and make money. You don't want to read those. You want to read something like this, where the author has done research, has examined a people and a culture, and has taken multi-perspectives. To me, that's complex. So trying to keep 4 characters straight in here, alternating points of view, and the language.
Death as a narrator. I mean,
Yeah,
there's...
the narrator of this is death. And when I started teaching this, the first class period, one of the students said, do you know who narrates this? I said, no, I didn't read the book. I never read books before I teach them. I think that's just a good policy, don't you? I said, of course I do. That's one of the reasons I picked the book. Because when you think of death, you think of something, the connotations associated with death are negative, right? You think of death. You think of, ooh, passing on to another life. How do I get there? He's coming after me. I always use death as a he. It could be a she, I guess. But God is a she, so death is... Come on, guys, lighten up a little bit here. Okay.
So these are very readable, very palatable, and I really don't think we're going to make lifelong readers by making students slog through Moby Dick. I feel like putting really good books into their hands. Another article I was reading about using literature, young adult literature, surveyed students and asked, why do you read? And it was because my teacher made me, so I can do well on the test, because I have to read this chapter for class, but it was never because books are magic or because I just can't quit reading. It had nothing to do with actual reading, and I think part of that is because of the dry reading material that is so often assigned.
And that one quote at the beginning about we've taken humanness out of our reading, that was a national survey. So people are recognizing that empathy and voice and moral courage, we face decisions every day. We are given choices every day. And how many of us have said to ourselves after making a choice, if only I had done this. That's what she asks. If only I had looked for her sooner, maybe she would have survived. If only. And that's when she decides, I am going to make a difference. It's going to be tough, but I'm going to make a difference. That courage in the face of death, not in the face of not passing a test or not getting a paper turned in the face of death, because that's a consequence. When the Nazis came in, they took everything. They cut phone lines. They took their radios. They gave them ration cards. You can just go down the line. And they weren't prepared in Amsterdam. They weren't prepared in Holland for the Nazis to come. So people were slow in reacting. And that's what she talks about in the novel. So, anyway.
And she has really good resources. So does Sepetys. So does Gratz. Many of these books include, so now that I've read this book, now that I care about it as a young person, how would I go about researching more. And so many of them include information to get to those primary documents to research. We've included a number of others. Book Thief we talked about. Mischling is really good. It's about the twin experiments in Auschwitz. So it's about Mengele Zoo and the medical experimentation that happened on very young children. And so the characters are fictional, but she did an enormous amount of research. So the characters represent her interview time with a number of survivors and the stories that they were able to tell her. So some of the characters are composite characters, but it's very readable. It reads like a novel, but she did exacting research. Canada is a young adult novel. It's written by a survivor who worked in Canada in Auschwitz. So the sorting out of people's belongings as they have been processed into the camp, as they've been sent to the gas chambers, all of their belongings had to be, according to the Nazis, looked through for any kind of valuables and sorted. So Eva Wiseman worked in that capacity and has written this novel. The Librarian of Auschwitz is about a young girl named Dita who is a survivor and had written a letter to Antonio Iturbe, who wrote this book, and he was able to do a lot of research on her. She kept books in Auschwitz in the children's block. She hid them in her dress, and at risk to all of their lives, they taught the children that were left in this block every day. They had school, and they said they had their history books were just people. So because they didn't have an access to good history books, they would go and just listen to oral history from whoever was available to teach that day. So the cover is gorgeous. The writing is not as gorgeous as the cover, unfortunately. I was really excited about this book, and it's not as much of a page turner. I don't know if some of that's because of the translation, if it's lost something in translation a little bit. It's still an excellent book. It's well researched. I was one that I was glad I read, but I think I just had really too high of hopes for it. This one I don't think I have on here. It's on your list though. Once by Morris Gleitzman. There's a series of 5. There's been now, I can't remember the other 2. It's written from the perspective of an 8-year-old boy named Felix. This is a middle grade reader, so something for 8, 9, 10-year-olds. And Yellow Star is written in verse based on a survivor's testimony. Prisoner B3087, my son just put that on his Christmas list, so that means I'll get it for him and then I'll get to read it. He'll share it with me. You've heard Girl in the Red Coat.
The Girl in the Red Coat is a memoir. She was at the debut of, what's his name?
Schindler's List.
Yeah, Schindler's List. And she watched it and she said, "That's me." So she claims in this book that the Schindler's List was written and then shown as a movie as a result of her wearing that red coat and someone seeing her and then passing that memory on to other people. It's a very readable memoir. And there's a couple of memoirs that we included in that list of people who actually went through the Holocaust and are relating. And unfortunately, the young man here passed away three years after she started doing research. But I love the fact that they have pictures in here of the people that she's talking about, where to get additional information, what resources, like Holly had said before, that you can use. I use young adult lit in my World Lit, Intro to Lit, and Intro to Fiction class. And inevitably, students come up after those classes and say, "You know, this was the first book I ever read." Now, that to me is scary, but they got through high school. I'm making assumptions, and I shouldn't, but how did they get through high school without reading a book? When I was in high school, I used to read Cliff Notes. So I think probably you read Spark Notes, I don't know, but you can go on the internet and find out everything about a book. And so I go on the internet and try to find out everything about a book I'm teaching, and then I teach it in a different way. so I can make sure that they're reading the book. Okay? And it works. It works. You know, some kids will say something in class, I ask a question, and it's like wrote from Sparks or wrote from, I said, no, let's look at it this way. And they actually read. And to me, that's exciting. And Holly mentioned this before, lifelong readers. No, you can't. You can read some books on that little thingy that you carry around, and then you bump into me in the hall because you're too busy looking at that instead of looking at the people around you. I walk into class and I said, the first rule of class, no phones, no computers in this class. You come in and you talk to Susie, or you talk to Nicole, or you talk to Jacinta, and get to know one another. Human touch, human speaking. So, anyway, I'm not a technology person. She got the thingamajiggy together. You know, this thingamajiggy? She got that thingamajiggy together.
So, going back to Salt to the Sea, history divided us, but through reading we can be united in story, study, and remembrance. Books join us together as a global reading community, but more important, a global human community striving to learn from the past. That one stuck out to me, and it was in the end when she's talking about her resources and further study and tell these stories. Survivors aren't going to be with us forever, so it's our job to pass these stories along.
And I think anytime you can introduce a book on diversity, we need more diverse books. That's a site that I go into a lot. We need more diverse books to explore, to get in touch with other cultures, other identities, so that we can enhance our own and we can help to enhance theirs too. People touching, giving voice to, probably shouldn't use the word touch today, but people reaching out to one another and understanding one another. Things aren't going to change unless we do that. The immigrant problem that we have now is not going to change unless we make a commitment to see that it does change and start treating people like they're human beings instead of the others. Does anybody have any questions? Do you have
Yeah, that's
anything
what I was
else?
about to ask
Okay.
if anyone had questions.
You want our autographs now, or should we wait until we make like $1 million or something?
For the one with artworks in it, the one that you said was translated, what was it translated from?
Spanish.
Spanish.
What was the question?
He had asked what this
yeah.
book was translated from. It was Spanish. He's from Spain. I can't quite remember how he got a hold
I
of
can't
her. He had read something that her husband had written. That's how it happened. He'd read something that her husband had written in his research about the Holocaust, and she responded to his query. She wrote him back, and then he, through talking to her, realizes that as a young girl she had been the librarian of Auschwitz. So,
One of the other things that I think our title had was Genocide. Is that the Genocide? A book that I taught dealt with the genocide in Cambodia. And students didn't know about Cambodia. They didn't know about the killing fields. And to me, I found out during my research that more Cambodians were killed by their own people than they were killed in the Holocaust. Genocide. I mean, I think you're killing your own people. That's happening in parts of our country now, where parts of our country, other countries are killing their own people so that they can get more drugs and more money and that kind of thing. So we don't want the Holocaust repeated. We don't want genocide repeated, and one of the ways that you can avoid that, read about it and then do something about it.
what other questions?
It's got to be more than one question. Oh, there we go. I'm sorry.
When were you introduced to the book thief?
The Book Thief? Boy, oh boy. I'd say probably at least 10 years ago. At least.
I read it 6
I
or
read it
7
when it
years
was
ago.
published. Let me see when it was published.
I read it I saw the previews for the film, so it was right before the movie came out, and I always want to read the book before I watch the movie. So
The movie did not do it any sort of justice at all.
I liked the movie. Of course, the book is always better.
The movie's so much better.
Yeah. So when were you introduced to the book, Phoebe?
I had actually, I wasn't aware that the book until after I had seen the film, and prior to reading, I thought the movie was amazing, and then I read the book, and I completely fell in love with the book. Like, the book is probably my favorite book, because I don't think I haven't read anything that Public Hand did. Just how it's written, the different perspectives, like, it's just so complex, and I read it, I was probably 14 when I read it, and it really did have an impact on how I was reading. It really opened my eyes. And it's just a really great book.
I think so too.
One of my classes, Intro to Fiction, last spring? No, spring before last. I brought 2 books in. This one, for sure. And then I brought in one that was this size. And I said, what would you guys like to read? What's the first novel you want to read in class? Let's read this one. And I said, really? I said, why do you want to read this one instead of this? Because it's shorter. And I said, good, we're going to read this one. And I put it on my list, and I said, that's going to be read the 8th week of the semester. See where it says teacher's choice? We're going to read this one. And I said, if you don't like it, by the time you finish it, if you don't respond to it and be moved by what goes on there, I'm not going to give you a final exam. Now, the chair didn't like that idea because we have to do that. But I said, I will do that. I said, crisscross my heart. And they did, and to a person. If you haven't read anything yet, this one will be, it should be in your top 10 list. Somebody can't write a book and be on the top 10 list since 2005 and not have a really good book. He's writing another one right now, which I'm really excited about. I can't wait until she decides to. She wrote another book. In fact, there's an excerpt about it. It takes place in Japan, and I will read that one too. But
I think it takes place here in the Japanese internment
right,
camps.
in Japanese internment camp, yeah. So I'm going to be reading that one.
Other questions or comments?
I was 20 when I read The Book Thief, and it wrecked me. I mean, in a good way, and I'm glad I read it, and I love it. I mean, and I'd probably read it again, but I'd probably take another year or so to like emotionally recover. I don't know. I've always had this like weird connection with like Germany. Like when I read it, it was the semester after I'd gotten back from a short-term study abroad, and they send the main character's adoptive dad to Essen, which is where I'd been all summer. And like in my German class, we had to choose a name for ourselves, and the one I chose, it wasn't from this, it was from a different movie I knew, but I chose Liesel. And just having that connection, I think, made it like even more intense.
One neat thing, and Nicole, you might want to read this, the family that ends up saving the Syrian family, killer, okay? Spoiler alert, plug your ears, is German.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So this family is able to find its way to Germany, the Syrian family is able to find its way to Germany, and they're taken in by,
Parts of the Syrian family, they throw out their baby too.
yeah,
Right.
when they're on a boat trying to get from one place to another place. It's just horrendous. But anyway, they're in Turkey, I think, and the boat runs into a rock, and it's just an inflatable thing, and so everybody's trying to save themselves and survive. And another boat's coming by, and the young boy says, "Mom, give Hannah two," and so they throw the baby there, and somebody takes the baby, and they hope that it survives, but they don't know. So a mother is willing to give her baby up in hopes that it will survive, that she, this case it was a little girl, that she will survive. So the sacrifices you make, but Germany comes through here, Nicole, just so you know, okay?
Have any of you read any of these other books that we've talked about?
I mean, my teacher read it to me, The Yellow Star.
Oh, okay. Yeah, and that was very short. I was kind of disappointed when I downloaded it because I wanted a long book.
Yeah.
I don't know if you guys read it. I didn't have it on the thing, but Number the Stars. That book was actually assigned to me in 6th grade, and we did a huge thing over it. And that one hurts too. I don't think.
That was the first one I read on the Holocaust when I was, I think, in the 5th grade. Number the Stars?
Oh, Number the
I wish
Stars,
that
yeah.
one would have been longer too, because there were so many intricate things that happened within it that I would have liked to have known more about what was going on.
Lois Lowry made a commitment, this was probably, what was it, 10 years ago, to come to Fort Hays to give presentations to students and high school teachers. And we raised the money to get her here, and she was going to come until she found out where Hays was. And I don't mean that in a bad way, but she'd have to change planes 3 times to get here from where she was. And she wrote back and told me, she actually wrote a letter, it wasn't an email. She actually wrote back and said, "I'm sorry, but at my age, I can't make that many plane changes." She said, even with help. So I'm not, but I was devastated because I was teaching her book, The Given, I think.
The Giver.
The Giver, that Giver. At that time, I thought, oh, crap. But anyway. Yes,
I have 2 things. So on the list, I've obviously. I
you
think
have 2
almost-
questions?
Yeah.
Oh,
Well, a comment and a
geez.
question. Sorry.
Dominate.
No.
Of course, and past year. I feel like most people who have read The Diary of a Young Girl by Anne Frank,
Mhm.
because like that's, I think that's always the first one I read. But one that was on this list I was surprised by was Night. I cannot
thought
remember
you-
who it's by, but I
Ellie
read
B.
that.
Sell. It should be on here. Yeah, it's on the bottom.
Oh, it's on the bottom. Okay.
Because it's not necessarily marketed for YA, so that's why I put it on the
And
second
that is
list.
one that when I saw it, I was tearing up in class. I think that's an understatement. So I think Night was probably because he made 2 more.
Day
also.
and Dawn.
Yeah.
They're on here
And,
too.
In fact, the writer here was influenced by The Diary of Anne Frank in her research, which is one of the reasons why she decided to write that particular book.
And then my question is, you were talking about the immigration problem we have in the United States right now, and it's horrible, and it's horrible how people are getting treated here and other places. So, you're talking about activists. What would you as us tigers here, want us to do in order to, help with the problem we have in the United States about treating people like absolute trash?
What would you want us to do as a Fort Hays community and
Start with the homeless here. Start with the problems that we face in our community here. I was an activist in the 60s. I won't tell you what I burned, but I did burn it. I was part of that generation. And we did march, and we did want change, whether it's the Me Too movement or whatever you're interested in. I think having food here is the food pantry here is a good start. Can you become more involved with the Community Assistance Center or something like that? Can you become involved with First Call for Help, where people who are in dire straits can call them, and the ministries, you can call them and say, look, I saw a homeless person here, what can I do to help? I think that's a big
I would say read as much as you can, read as
Yeah.
widely as you can, educate yourself on the historical events, but current events as well. Come to the library and read is my suggestion for activism. Any other questions?
And if you haven't read the book, The Hate You Give, it has nothing to do with this, but The Hate You Give is one of the finest young adult books that has been written. They made it into a movie. Don't see the movie until you read the book. But you talk about a different society. It takes place in an African-American ghettoized area. It's an excellent, excellent book on bullying and peer review and all that kind of good junk, and the movie just came out. So if you've got some free time, if you don't, make time. I've got 2 copies of it because I am lending one of them out all the time. So, and, okay, Brian, do you have a question? So I'll shut up.
Oh, no, I wouldn't actually do that. One, I think YA fiction, specifically as it relates to the show, when done well, is invaluable because it does engender that empathy and the idea that you can connect with people and situations really alien to you. That being said, he was really critical.
Okay.
Too often I have found that fictions related to the Holocaust tend to center around either those in hiding and influence on YA fiction, but it's that experience of being in hiding, or in the camp systems, with Elie Wiesel, or Gabby Klein, or some of the books you described. And if that's the introduction students get to the Holocaust, there's a danger of essential, even though they present individuals in individual circumstances, and they're all quite different, and kind of tears down that monolith of there being just 6 million dead instead of 6 million individuals. The experiences related are all still kind of essentialized in like the camp system, and you lose that when you're unexposed to things like being, killed in the field ad hoc, like in Belarus and Ukraine or what have you, or being in a resistance, And then there's also though the danger too of fetishizing the Holocaust.
Is what?
Fetishizing the Holocaust.
And being so emotionally overwhelmed that it's the emotion, and you should be touched by it, obviously. It's the idea that you're so overwhelmed by this pluralism that it just seems like this monstrous thing that doesn't happen, instead of appreciating that it happened in phases. And we ask ourselves questions like, why didn't so-and-so do this? Why didn't you, why did you just save this one person? We're not understanding that when it was occurring, they didn't know that, hey, this is the Holocaust. Especially with
That's what this book does. I mean, it does.
And
They
I think
didn't realize.
That's in the book Thief too. I do like how you have this sort of slow progression of you see German civilians, you see people who are maybe not speaking out but are sympathetic, or people who are resisting. So I think it's a little bit more multi-layered, and ideally people who read these will then study the history, study the primary documents, look at.
And I think they do a better job now of showing that nuance, those gray areas between that sometimes the victim was a collaborator.
And that's in this one too?
Right.
Oh my God, okay. So there you go. Thank you so much. Would you please read this, because I think Brian would like to too? Okay, thank you so much,
And it's
Brian.
important to remember that it's not just, the SS that's doing this. These
Right.
are
Right.
Jan Gross and Poland writing about the neighbors, and they don't need a lot of encouragement, or even a presence of the family and so on.
There are a lot of good nonfiction, and we debated whether to include that in our discussion, but we came up with the topic before we thought about nonfiction. But The Plot to Kill Hitler is really a good nonfiction young adult book. So there are several books out there that are nonfiction that are just as readable and give you an idea how historiography, how history is written and studied. So.
And this certainly isn't meant to
Yeah.
replace
But I'm just-
nonfiction in any way.
My, not even a concern, just the idea that this is the first exposure the student has. It will still be, they'll feel it on a deeper level than just, this is a statistic. But yeah, it'll be, and I think you probably experienced this thing when I have to teaching modern civ, you'll understand the Holocaust is boom to see extermination camps.
Right.
And there's just so much more to it than that.
I don't, keep talking, because I don't want to call on him again. He's already asked 3 questions.
No, but he's got good questions.
What's your question?
It's actually kind of a response to what you said. So, with the emphasis, that was, thank you, just with that of the Holocaust, I read this book in middle school, and it was about like, it was completely fiction. It had some accuracies, some inaccuracies. And it was for middle schoolers, you know, or the high schoolers, depending on the reading level. And I've never read anything in my life that was more, I cannot believe they made this into a book. And it was about like superpowers and like, if Germany would have won World War II. And it was
Just
absolutely,
counterfactual.
it was counterfactual. And that part was fine, because it's interesting to see how the world would have been if that would have been how it goes. But it really, like,
Well, you have things like Philip K. Dick's.
And it
what's
does.
the
Man in the high
Tower?
cap, light in the house, man in the high cap.
But even,
Yeah, they definitely did it wrong. If
Sure.
that makes sense. And that was one of my first exposures, because I don't really like reading Holocaust books, because I'm pretty sure I'm not good at that route. It's not fun seeing what happened to my people. But it was one of my first experiences with that, and like, they just glossed over certain things that are extremely important. And I feel like if you're gonna write a book like this, especially when you still survivors, you need to do it right or not at all.
well, fictionalized accounts of things, because I mean, Leslie, you and Shu, you probably remember when Holocaust came out in
Yeah,
the late
the movie.
'70s on NBC. And it was in trying to reach enough people and provide not necessarily shock, but provide a story that was palatable.
Right.
It became just kind of just a really commercial attempt and trying to catch, hey, this is the Holocaust, when it's not.
Yeah.
This is the Holocaust, this is the Holocaust.
Has anybody been to the Holocaust Museum in Washington? I mean, that's unbelievable.
I couldn't make it past the
Unbelievable
shul.
museum.
I got there and I had to leave. It was-
That's what's so hard. You get there and then you go, oh my gosh, it's overwhelming.
I think we have one more question, and then we have to wrap it up because we're running out of time.
The book thief that was, and I remember this was, that was like the first, like, more realistic encounter with what the Holocaust was like. And that opened my eyes a little bit, but I still feel like there are so many things, like videos, clips and things taken after, World War II had ended that a lot of people don't have access to, that opens your eyes to. On Netflix, they released a documentary of one of the first, times that the Allies had made it into the camps after World War II. And it shows what the camps were like. They were showing lamps that had shades that were made out of Jewish people's skin. I think that hits, but you can't show that to a young child.
Right.
Yeah, you can't, because there's no concept to that. Like, it just, I don't know.
Even that's kind of not misleading in the fact that it happened, but the footage taken by the Allies literally in Dachau and Berlin, those were concentration camps. Those were the Syrian camps. I mean, the bulk of the Holocaust took place in these. And so when we see these horrible things, these massive bodies being disposed of, even outrageous and Titus, that in itself is just a small piece. I mean, most of the victims of the Holocaust were either buried in ravines in Ukraine or they went up to the snow steppes. So
Yeah.
you have to, anytime we expose this to sensational stuff, and as a shop that you have to appreciate that.
Thank you all for coming. Hope you have a good rest of your day.
Thank you, Brian, for answering that question.